Hey folks, thanks for joining me for this episode from the Embellish Pod. If you got here by chance, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button. Hopefully I can be found on any podcasting platform that exists, and if you can't find me on a platform, you can send me an email at embellishpod@gmail.com and I'll try to get that taken care of. You can also find video versions of this podcast on YouTube. You can find all of my links on Instagram at embellishpod or TikTok with the same handle. I have a website. It is www.embellishpod.com. It's a place to pick up these links, episode details, and more. We're coming back off of a few weeks break from, the holidays and all the other things that are going on, but also the yearly January existential crisis that happens with this particular podcast, where I decide, do we want to do another year of this or not? I've got a few folks that are still reaching out and wanting to do some interviews, so I think, we're probably going to continue along the way, but some time back, I developed a series that I would use to plug in times whenever I just didn't have anything ready to go. And we started doing what was called the Scotch Whisky Discovery Series, and we're running through different regions and then tasting along with it, because I've been really fortunate to be provided with some phenomenal samples from both friends, from listeners, and even from a handful of brands that have given me an opportunity to taste out some things. So I wanted to kind of carry you guys through this process, and we've done 5 episodes, 4 regions so far, and now it's time to move on. And so we're going to talk today about Lowland and Campbeltown, a place of elegance and rarity. And without, a whole lot of other to do about it, we're going to kind of get into all of it, right? Duncan McCallum thought he'd saved Campbeltown whiskey. In 1924, he bought Glen Scotia Distillery when the region was hemorrhaging distilleries. Over a dozen had already closed, and more were circling the drain. McCallum believed quality and persistence could turn the tide. He poured everything he had into keeping Glen Scotia alive. It didn't work. By 1930, the economics were brutal. American prohibition had collapsed export demand. Blenders were sourcing from Speyside instead. Easier access via the new railways, and frankly, a more consistent quality after Campbelltown's rush to overproduce had damaged its reputation. McCallum faced impossible choices: compromise on quality to stay solvent, or maintain standards and watch his investment evaporate. Pressure broke him. In December 1930, Duncan McCallum walked into Campbeltown Loch and drowned himself. The official record lists it as a tragic accident, but locals, they know better. A failed business deal, mounting debts, and the weight of watching an entire region's whiskey heritage crumble, it was just too much. The thing that stays with me about McCallum's story, he wasn't wrong about Campbeltown whiskey. The problem wasn't the spirit itself, it was timing, infrastructure, and the brutal economics of the 1920s depression. In the 1880s, Campbeltown had over 20 active distilleries simultaneously. Alfred Bernard spent weeks in visiting them all and called it the whiskey capital of the world. But when American prohibition created enormous demand, many producers cut corners. Shorter fermentation, inferior casks, premature bottling. When quality mattered again, Campbeltown's reputation was shot. The collapse was devastating. By 1934, only Springbank and Glen Scotia survived. Buildings were demolished, equipment sold for scrap, expertise scattered. An entire whiskey culture nearly vanished. Today, Glen Scotia workers still report strange occurrences in certain areas of the distillery after dark. They'll tell you it's McCallum's ghost still walking the distillery he couldn't save. Superstition? Maybe. But it's a reminder that behind every bottle of whiskey, there are people who bet everything on getting it right. The fact that Campbeltown survived at all and is now experiencing a genuine renaissance, and with new distilleries planned, is a testament to the few who refused to let it die. McCallum didn't live to see it, but his instinct was correct. Campbeltown whiskey deserved to survive. So tonight, as we explore Lowland, Elegance, and Campbeltown's hard-won revival, keep McCallum's story in mind Every region's whiskey culture is more fragile than it appears, and preservation requires both belief and brutal, honest economics. We'll taste whiskey from the distillery that McCallum tried to save, and from a distillery that secured Campbelltown's future 74 years after his death. Tonight, we're pairing two Scottish regions that couldn't be more different in personality, yet share something crucial. Both had to fight for survival in their own ways. The Lowlands encompass everything south of an imaginary line from Greenock to Dundee that separates Scotland's whiskey regions more by tradition than geography. This is whiskey that doesn't shout for attention. Lowland distilleries traditionally emphasize finesse over power, approachable flavors over challenging complexity. Many use triple distillation, which is unusual for Scottish but common for Irish whiskey. And they create an extra smoothness that makes these expressions excellent entry points for newcomers. Lowland whiskey's accessibility sometimes gets dismissed as simplicity, which misses the point entirely. These distilleries operate near major cities, not remote glens. The urban context shaped their approach. More industrial efficiency, closer to integration with blending operations, less romance, but serious efficiency. Modern producers like Glasgow Distillery are embracing that urban heritage while proving that approachable doesn't mean boring. Expect light, grassy flavors with minimal peat influence, cereal and fruit notes instead of smoke and maritime character, but the best lowland expressions layer complexity without intimidation. They're training wheels that serious enthusiasts never actually outgrow. Campbelltown is the opposite story in every way. Isolated on the remote Kintyre Peninsula, this place became a whiskey boomtown precisely because of its isolation. Difficult for excise officers to reach, abundant local resources, deep water harbors for shipping, and over 30 distilleries operated here at various points in the 1800s, with about 20 plus running simultaneously during the Victorian peak. The boom created its own destruction. When American prohibition generated massive illegal demand, Campbelltown producers rushed to meet it. Quality control went out the window, corners were cut, standards dropped, and when legitimate markets returned, Campbelltown whiskey had a reputation for inconsistency that Speyside and Highland distilleries happily exploited. The collapse was swift and merciless. 17 distilleries closed in 1920s alone. By 1934, only Springbank and Glen Scotia remained. For decades, Campbelltown teetered on the edge of losing its status as a whiskey region entirely. What saved it? Hedley Wright's 2004 decision to reopen Glengyle Distillery, the first new Campbelltown distillery in 125 years. That brought the count to 3 active distilleries, matching the Lowlands and securing Campbelltown's regional status. Wright wasn't just preserving his family's heritage, he was protecting an entire whiskey culture from extinction. Modern Campbelltown whiskeys are known for their distinctive funk, earthy, agricultural notes that some describe as barnyard-like or farmhouse funk. It's polarizing. You either love it or you don't, but you can't mistake it for anything else. That character comes from traditional production methods, maritime influences from the peninsula's Atlantic exposure, and yeast strains that are developed over centuries of isolation. The 3 surviving distilleries, Springbank, Glen Scotia, and Glengyle, producing Kilkerran, each interpret Campbelltown character differently while maintaining what makes the region unique. Their whiskeys reward patience. These aren't crowd pleasers designed for mass appeal. They're complex, sometimes challenging, always interesting. So tonight's lineup pairs urban reinvention with rural survival. Glasgow Distillery's modern triple distillation meets Glen Scotia's century-plus battle for existence, and Kilkerran's traditional preservation mission. Accessibility meets complexity meets hard-won survival. Let's see what the contrast teaches us. Before we dive too deep into what we're tasting, we're going to talk about how we're tasting it, and more specifically, the glassware involved. We are going to return to Kilkerran glasses tonight. The same trusted standard that we use for all kinds of tastings. It's the concept of if it's not broke, don't fix it, and the Kilkerran has earned its reputation in the whiskey industry for a standard for a good reason. For tonight's specific lineup, the Kilkerran handles our challenges perfectly. We have 2 expressions bottled at 92 proof, gentle enough that we don't need a wider bowl to tame the alcohol, but substantial enough that we want a good aromatic concentration. The Glencairn's tulip shape captures delicate characteristics in both the Glasgow triple distilled spirit and the aged Glen Scotia complexity. The light fruit, the subtle maritime notes, the differences between Lowland, refinement, and Campbeltown character. Then, when we jump to the Kilkerran cask strength at 116.2 proof, that's where the Glencairn really earns its keep. The tapered rim helps to manage with the initial alcohol intensity while letting us appreciate the full Campbeltown funk. We can nose it neat and get a complete picture. Then add water if you choose, and you can see how the glass will allow us to track the evolution as the dilution opens up the flavor profiles. Now, the real advantage is availability and versatility. We're moving from an elegant Lowland refinement to aged Campbeltown complexity to young cask strength intensity. That's a dramatic sensory journey. The Glencairn doesn't favor any particular style. It presents each whiskey honestly, concentrating what needs concentrating, managing what needs managing. Since we've covered the idea of what the Glencairn is, its history, in previous conversations, I won't repeat all of that tonight. Just know that we're using a proven tool that lets the whiskeys speak for themselves. Sometimes the best equipment choice is the one that gets out of the way and lets you focus on what's actually in the glass. The featured whiskeys for tonight will be a Glasgow Distillery 1770 triple distilled. It is 92 proof and non-age stated. It is an urban Lowland innovation. Then we'll move to the Glen Scotia 15-year-old, which is also at 92 proof. It is a Campbeltown survivor with McCallum's legacy specifically. And then we'll finish with the Kilkerran cask strength, which is 116 proof, but only 8 years old. It is Campbeltown revival at full strength. So let's do a deep dive into the Glasgow Distillery. For over a century, Glasgow, Scotland's largest city and once major whiskey production center, had no operating distilleries. The last one, Dundashill, closed in 1902 after financial struggles forced a sale to DCL. The distillery had been enormous. It had founded in the 1770s. It grew to become one of Scotland's largest malt whiskey producers, but urban economics changed. Blending and bottling companies stayed in Glasgow, but actual distillation moved to cheaper, more spacious, and rural locations. Enter Liam Hughes, Mike Hayward, and Ian McDougall, all 2012. Enter Liam Hughes, Mike Hayward, and Ian McDougall in 2012. All three had drinks industry backgrounds and watched the craft distillery boom happening in America. And they saw an opportunity. Why shouldn't Scotland's largest city produce whiskey again? The challenges were immediate. Urban distilling requires navigating zoning restrictions, neighbor relations, noise ordinances, space constraints that rural distilleries rarely ever face. They needed financing in an industry dominated by established players, and they needed to convince people that urban whiskey wasn't just a novelty. Hughes had worked with the Russell family, who runs logistics operations moving spirits around Scotland. When he approached them about converting one of their warehouses into a distillery, they initially laughed, until they realized he was actually serious. They found a space in Hillington Industrial Park, and Glasgow Distillery Company was born. The company incorporated in 2012, secured the facility in 2013, and began gin production in 2014. Macard Gin became Glasgow's first legally produced gin and generated revenue while the whiskey matured. Whiskey production started March of 2015, and by 2018 they released their first single malt to immediate sellout success. Glasgow Distillery's defining characteristic is triple distillation, which is unusual for Scotland, but central to their particular approach. Most Scottish distilleries use a two-step distillation. Wash stills separate alcohol from fermented wash. Spirit stills refine it into new make. Triple distillation adds an intermediate step, creating a lighter, more refined spirit. Their initial setup used two stills, Tara and Mahari, both named after family members. In 2019, they doubled capacity by adding Margaret and Frances, named after the famous MacDonald sisters who were pioneering Glasgow-style artists. They also operated Annie, a separate gin still. Triple distillation works like this. The first pass separates the alcohol from the wash. The second distillation in an intermediate still refines to low wines. And the final pass creates a Pass creates a finished new make spirit at around 68 to 70% ABV. This process removes more congeners, which are flavor compounds created during fermentation, than traditional Scottish distillations. This creates a cleaner spirit with subtler flavors and no harsh edges. But there's a trade-off. You need precise temperature control to maintain complexity while achieving smoothness. Do it wrong and you get a vodka-like neutrality. Do it right and you get an approachable spirit that still has personality to it. The technique requires more time and energy than two-step distillation, increasing production costs, but it allows Glasgow Distillery to create a distinct house style while honoring historical Glasgow distilling methods. Some historical Glasgow distilleries produce triple distilled expressions alongside their traditional malts. City-based production creates problems rural distilleries never consider. Space is expensive and limited. Glasgow lacks room for traditional dunnage warehouses, so casks mature at a established Scottish location while maintaining Glasgow identity throughout the initial distillation and eventual bottling in the city. Noise restrictions limit the operating hours and require sound dampening materials. Neighbor relations matter when your production affects the nearby businesses. Community engagement becomes essential. Tours, tastings, and education built local support while managing expectations about industrial activity. But urban locations offer advantages too. Easier access to tours and visitors, better transportation links for distribution, proximity to hospitality for direct relationships with bars and restaurants, the ability to create a metropolitan whiskey identity that differentiates from traditional Highland romance. Glasgow Distillery proved urban whiskey production was viable, inspiring other city-based projects throughout Scotland and beyond. The flagship 1770 triple distilled represents pure Glasgow character without additional influences. The name references the year Dundashill was founded, connecting modern innovation with historical heritage. The expression showcases triple distillation at its best, approachable entry point for newcomers, enough complexity for an interest for experienced drinkers. Maturation uses first fill ex-bourbon casks, emphasizing the clean spirit character rather than the heavy wood influence. At 92 proof, it's gentle enough for neat sipping while maintaining flavor intensity. The market has responded really well. Glasgow Distillery has expanded production, won industry awards, including Scottish Whisky Distillery of the Year in 2020, and established distribution in over 25 countries. Not bad for a distillery that didn't exist about a decade ago. They're not positioning themselves as disruptors, tearing down the old ways, nor are they claiming to recreate historical methods exactly. They're doing something harder, creating contemporary whiskey that honors Glasgow's distilling heritage while acknowledging modern realities. Now we can pivot over to a conversation about Glen Scotia. Glen Scotia survived against all odds. Glen Scotia's founding dates to 1832, making it one of Campbeltown's older distilleries, though its early history is murky. What's clear is that it survived when nearly everything around it collapsed, and the survival wasn't pretty. The distillery changed hands repeatedly, closed multiple times, operated sporadically, and came within inches of permanent closure on several occasions. Duncan McCallum bought it in 1924 during Campbelltown's death spiral. He believed he could weather the storm through quality production and careful management, but as we discussed in the opening, the economics overwhelmed him. His 1930 suicide became a part of Glen Scotia's identity. Workers still report the unexplained phenomena in certain buildings, particularly in the older warehouses. After McCallum's death, Glen Scotia limped along under various owners. It closed in 1928, reopened in 1930, closed again in 1933, reopened in 1934. This pattern, close, reopen, struggle, close again, continued for decades. The Bloch brothers purchased it in 1933 and they kept it alive barely through World War II and difficult post-war years. In 1954, Hiram Walker bought Glen Scotia and invested in modernization. They rebuilt parts of the distillery and stabilized production, but even that ownership couldn't make it consistently profitable. In 1984, it closed again. It opened in 1989 under Gibson International and closed again in 1994. Each closure threatened permanence. Equipment was stripped, buildings deteriorated, expertise scattered, but somehow Glen Scotia kept coming back. In 1999, Loch Lomond Group purchased Glen Scotia. This marked a turning point. Instead of viewing it as a struggling asset to extract value from, they committed to long-term investment. They renovated buildings, upgraded equipment, increased capacity from 750,000 to 1 million liters annually, and most importantly, maintained consistent production. Under Loch Lomond ownership, Glen Scotia finally achieved stability. They developed a core range of expressions, invested in marketing, and positioned the distillery as a premium Campbeltown producer rather than a budget alternative. Quality improved as management brought proper resources and modern standards while respecting traditional methods. The distillery still operates traditionally in key ways: 2 copper pot stills, a wash still, a spirit still, and both are fairly small. Stainless steel washbacks for fermentation, water from Cross Hill Loch, the same source that's been used since the 1800s. Worm tub condensers on the stills create that heavier, more textured spirit character. Glen Scotia's 15-year-old represents what the distillery can achieve with time and quality cask selection. This isn't cask strength experimentation or unusual finishing. It's well-aged Campbeltown whiskey demonstrating traditional character developed over a decade and a half. The maturation uses primarily ex-bourbon casks with some ex-sherry influence, though exact percentages vary by batch. At 92 proof, it's approachable but maintains enough strength to carry the flavor intensity that the age and wood influence will create. What makes this expression significant isn't innovation, it's consistency. Glen Scotia is proving that they can produce reliably excellent whiskey year after year. After a century of start-stop production, financial chaos, and constant uncertainty, this consistency represents genuine achievement. The 15-year-old showcases classic Campbeltown characteristics, maritime influence, light peat smoke, fruit complexity, and a whole host of other things. But it's refined. It's not aggressive or challenging like some younger Campbeltown expressions. Age has integrated the various flavor elements into a cohesive whole. Glen Scotia's survival matters beyond one distillery's balance sheet. When Campbeltown dropped 2 operating distilleries, just Springbank and Glen Scotia, the region faced existential threat. Lose Glen Scotia, and Campbeltown loses its regional designation. All its history, all its distinct character, all its whiskey heritage gets absorbed into Highland as a geographic footnote. That didn't happen because someone kept Glen Scotia alive through the decades when it made no financial sense. Multiple owners poured money into marginally profitable distillery because they believed Campbeltown whiskey heritage was worth preserving. Now, with 3 distilleries operating and more planned, Campbeltown is experiencing a genuine renaissance. Whiskey tourists visit specifically to experience this remote peninsula. Campbeltown Malts Festival attracts international attention. Young distillers are choosing to work here rather than fleeing to Speyside. The region has hope again. Glen Scotia represents the survivor. Not the innovator like Kilkerran, not the tradition keeper like Springbank, but the scrappy operation that refused to die no matter how many times economic reality said it should. There's something admirable about the stubbornness. Sometimes survival itself is the achievement. Here's the thing about ghost stories. They're really not about supernatural phenomena. They're about guilt and responsibility. Campbeltown couldn't save McCallum, but it could save his distillery. Workers keeping Glen Scotia alive are keeping his bet alive too. The belief that quality Campbeltown whiskey deserves to exist. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, there's a genuine haunting in these buildings. Every distillery that closed represents families destroyed, expertise lost, communities diminished. Glen Scotia survived, but it carries the weight of what was lost around it. That's why tonight's Glen Scotia 15-year-old matters beyond its flavor profile. It's proof that persistence pays off. It's evidence that quality can survive economic catastrophe if someone commits to protecting it. It's a 15-year-old whiskey from a distillery that's closed and reopened so many times that consistent aging seems impossible. Duncan McCallum died believing he'd failed, but every bottle of Glen Scotia proves he was right about what mattered. The whiskey itself was worth fighting for. In 2000, Campbeltown faced an existential threat. The Scotch Whisky Association was codifying regional designations into EU law. With only 2 operational distilleries, Springbank and Glen Scotia, Campbeltown risks losing regional status entirely. The Lowlands had 3 active distilleries, establishing it as the minimum threshold. Hedley Wright, owner of Springbank, and William Mitchell's great-great-nephew recognized what was at stake. This wasn't just about business. It was about preserving Campbeltown's identity as a whiskey region. He purchased Glengyle's derelict buildings through newly formed Mitchell's Glengyle Limited and committed to a full restoration. The challenges were substantial. Buildings needed extensive structural repairs. Modern regulations required updates to meet current standards. Equipment had to be sourced, and they acquired used stills from the defunct Ben Wyvis Distillery at Invergordon, converting it to function at Glengyle. Renovation took about 4 years. On March 25th, 2004, Glengyle distilled its first new make in nearly 80 years. Campbeltown had 3 open distilleries. Again, regional status was secured. Why did they call it Kilkerran? The whiskey couldn't be called Glengyle. The trademark complications meant another company owned the name. Instead, they chose Kilkerran, Campbeltown's original name, from the early Christian settlement of St. Kieran. That choice connected the whiskey to a deeper history while avoiding legal issues. Building brand recognition was challenging without matching distillery and whiskey names, but the quality of the spirit overcame that confusion. Kilkerran became a cult following based off of the whiskey itself. Kilkerran enjoys using production techniques that disappeared elsewhere as the industry modernized. Arm tub condensers instead of modern shell and tube condensers. Long fermentation times, 70 to 110 hours. Specific yeast strains that contribute to Campbeltown's distinctive character. The distillery sources from Springbank's floor maltings, one of the few Scottish distilleries still malting its own barley. The malt is peated to 12 to 15 parts per million phenol, creating a moderate smoke structure. Production is deliberately limited. The distillery operates only a few months per year, producing around 60,000 to 100,000 liters annually, despite having capacity for more. That controlled approach prioritizes quality over volume, a lesson learned from Campbeltown's boom-bust history. Kilkerran cask strength reveals full Campbeltown intensity without dilution or chill filtration. At 116.2 proof, it demonstrates how the region's whiskeys handle high strength while maintaining complexity. The 8-year age statement is deliberate, young enough to show vibrant, energetic character, and old enough that the whiskey has developed beyond raw new make spirit. At cask strength, this age sweet spot creates intensity without harshness. The expression showcases what people mean by Campbeltown funk. Earthy agricultural notes that distinguish the region, its polarizing character that comes from traditional production methods, maritime influences, specific water chemistry from Crosshill Loch. Beyond producing excellent whiskey, Glengyle serves as a guardian of Campbeltown's whiskey heritage. The distillery maintains traditional techniques that nearly disappeared, preserves historical knowledge, and trains new generations in methods that survived only through institutional memory at Springbank. Hedley Wright passed away in 2023, but ownership structure through family trust ensures continuity. The distillery isn't chasing growth for its own sake, it's protecting something irreplaceable while demonstrating that Campbeltown whiskey deserves its place alongside Scotland's other regions. When you drink Kilkerran, you're tasting that commitment. It's whiskey with purpose beyond profit, though fortunately it's profitable enough to sustain itself. That's the sweet spot behind every heritage distillery. Financial viability that supports cultural preservation. Let's get into what's actually in the glass today. We are moving from Lowland Elegance through Campbeltown Survival to Campbeltown Revival. Each expression teaches us something about regional character, production choices, and what perseverance tastes like. The Glasgow 1770 Triple Distilled, the Glen Scotia 15-year-old, and the Kilkerran cask strength. First up, we'll do the Glasgow 1770 at 92 proof. The color on this is really, really, really thin. At least in bourbon standards, not necessarily in Scotch standards. It shows something kind of light to it. The nose gives me a distinct cherry candy smell, as well as some orange and a little bit of grass to it. And we talked a little bit about the Glencairns, and Glencairns are pretty standard here, but the palate on this is a little peppery. There's some grass, there's some artificial lemon. And then as it finishes out, it moves into a pithy place, like the white parts of any citrus, that slightly bitter feeling that exists there. Next up is going to be the Glen Scotia 15-year-old. And this one has a little bit more color to it, as to be expected, right? Because it is significantly older. We should notice some immediate character changes. It's the same proof as the Glasgow, but a very, very, very different personality. The nose gives me a little bit of a saltwater taffy, but if it was a caramel and some citrus oil. The palate gives me like a spice-studded orange that you might see on a stovetop around Christmas time or whatever. There's some wood to this, a little bit of wood to this, and then a slight medicinal note. And then as it finishes out, there's a lingering sensation of smoke and oak here. And certainly last but not least, we're moving to the Kilkerran cask strength, right? It is significantly younger than the previous one, but at cask strength, we're seeing a lot more color to it. We probably need to take a deep breath here before we dive into this one, because we're jumping up, 20 points almost here. It's a huge step up intensity. Immediately, it's smoky, it's earthy, it's caramel, it's dry red wine, maybe a little bit of a leather to it. The palate of it is like a thick jelly, like a homemade jelly, but a thick version of it. Sometimes they're thin, sometimes they're thick, depending upon how you make it out. I can feel the proof, but sort of like the way that like a pineapple is eating your tongue, right? The high acidity of a pineapple, that's the way the proof sort of feels on this. And then as it finishes, it settles into a really nice, smoky grapefruit. I really, really like that last one there. So what did we learn through all of this? We learned that whiskey regions survive through different strategies. The Lowlands lost most of the distilleries, but are experiencing an urban revival. Glasgow Distillery proves city-based production works if you solve logistical challenges. Campbeltown nearly vanished entirely, but held on through sheer stubbornness. Glen Scotia and Springbank surviving decades when survival made no economic sense. Then Kilkerran securing the region's future. We learned that approachable doesn't mean simple. Glasgow's triple distilled expression offers an entry point for newcomers while demonstrating real technical achievement. It's elegance through restraint, and it's harder than it looks. When we learned that distinctive regional character is worth preserving, even when it limits market appeal. Campbelltown's funk won't appeal to everyone, but whiskey would be poorer without it. The Glen Scotia 15-year-old and the Kilkerran cask strength prove quality and tradition can coexist profitably if you're patient. We learned that survival can be the achievement. Glen Scotia's century of closures and reopenings wasn't glamorous or inspiring. It was a desperate struggle, but someone kept fighting every single time. That persistence created the stability that allows 15-year-old whiskey to exist today. We learned that heritage preservation requires both belief and economics. Hedley Wright didn't reopen Glengyle out of pure sentiment. He made a sound business calculation that Campbeltown whiskey should and could be profitable if someone invested properly. Belief without economics is just nostalgia. Economics without belief is just exploitation. The combination creates sustainability. The contrast between these three expressions, urban versus rural, innovation versus tradition, accessibility versus complexity, survival versus revival, reveals whiskey's incredible diversity within a relatively small country. Every bottle reflects choices about production philosophy, target audience, and relationship with tradition. Duncan McCallum didn't live to see Campbelltown's revival. He died believing the region's whiskey culture had vanished. But Glen Scotia survived another 90 plus years. Glengyle reopened 74 years after closing. Today, Campbeltown is experiencing a genuine renaissance with new distilleries planned and international recognition growing. McCallum was right about what mattered. The whiskey itself was worth fighting for. He was just in the wrong timeline. Sometimes belief in quality takes generations to vindicate. Next episode, we're shifting our focus entirely. We'll explore independent bottler companies that select exceptional casks and present them without constraints of corporate house styles. Think of it as whiskey curation, finding the outliers, the special moments, the expressions that distilleries might not bottle. It's a different way of experiencing familiar distilleries and discovering what's possible when you prioritize individual cask quality over brand consistency. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Embellish Pod. If you enjoyed this, please leave me a review on whatever platform you're consuming this on. Leave a comment if at all possible. Hit me up on social media on TikTok or Instagram using Embellish Pod, and give me a follow so you can keep up with what's going on here. I can also be found at www.embellishpod.com with all of my links, accounts, contact details, and maybe even some articles about whiskey or other things, as well as cocktail recipes. Thanks for stopping by.